maybe let me introduce myself a bit first, because in a way I'm not the kind of person you would expect to be here on an occasion like this. Because in many ways I'm sort of an outsider in this group of in-service educators. Although I have been throughout my professional career part of European projects and national projects on teacher education, I was basically a psychologist of learning and involved in many other kinds of settings and projects in which learning was the central theme. One of the themes I got involved in increasingly was the field of disaster management, which currently, I think in these days, has become more and more relevant with all the floods and landslides and wildfires and political crises, etc. we are involved in. So I think that maybe I was invited to be here because I have these other angles as well. So I can, and that's very welcome on a day like this where it's very hot, that I can sort of spread a fresh wind in this room. So the outline of my presentation is like this. I will first mention a few of the issues we are facing in this world today, and then focus on crises. I mentioned it already. This is a time of transition. We are facing different circumstances. We have an increased feeling that we can't go on the way we have acted so far. So I'd like to focus on that. But of course, I'm not here to spread news about crisis management. I'm here to turn that into something relevant for the educational sector. So I also focus on the issues in the education sector, although they are partially related to the crises we are in. And then I turn to the theme of the conference, which is Teacher Educators on the Move. And I will try to explain thoughts people have. I found them in academic literature, I found them in policy documents, and I thought about it myself. So I'd like to tell you about directions in which teacher educators move or might move, and how they might move together. Together as teacher educators among them, but also together with other relevant, let's say, neighboring disciplines in their field. So first, the changes in the world. It is summarized here very basically, but if you look at time, then we see that we have moved from the mechanical revolution to the introduction of mass production, to the introduction of computers, to the sort of next move where computers became basically communication tools and supported us in sharing and elaborating thoughts and knowledge. And now increasingly we are again facing a next stage where knowledge is believed not to be something which is somewhere and which needs to be spread to others, but it is something that is somehow anywhere and is evolving sometimes even in its own right without individuals feeling very much in control of it. And I think of all these artificial intelligence developments where we really feel that the idea of knowledge is something that is defined and needs to be spread, has made place for it is something that sort of evolves, that develops, that is enriched by everybody being part of its development. But somehow it has to be either checked on its validity, or it has to be kept under control there where it is sort of turning against us. So I'd like to think about that as well. Then if we look at the world from this crisis perspective, then of course we in Europe are shocked about the fact that there's a war going on and that affects so many people to such an extent we never had expected this ever to happen again, at least I didn't. Another thing Europe is facing, well, of course, the war in Ukraine brought a lot of people from Ukraine to Europe. Actually, I think it was up to 12 million people, of whom then 3 million again returned. So that's a substantial influx in the European Union. But there's, of course, migration of whatever kind in Europe. And I dived into the data about that, and in a way I felt that we are bombarded in the media about huge influxes of migrants, and it's often sketched as a threat. And words are used, metaphors like tsunami and horrible metaphors. And if you look at the reality, then you see that the number of migrants coming to the EU is actually 2 million people, which is on the total of the number of Europeans not really impressive. And if you then look at how it affects the European population, then it appeared that in the year 2020 and the year 2021, the population of Europe even shrank. So I think, and at the same time we're seeing a shortage of professionals in whatever sector. We need craftsmanship, we need experience. So I think, for me at least, it was revealing to see how the situation statistically and based on facts is as compared to the way it is dealt with in the news media, I think. A third thing we are focusing on or confronted with is the energy crisis. Not unrelated, of course, to the war we're in. But it means that well, prices go up, people find it hard to keep up their standards. If they can't keep up their standards, they try their luck elsewhere, and that again adds to, let's say, migration or influx of people in other countries. Then we have the climate change, which has the same effect. Parts of Europe now even become difficult to live in, and because they're too hot. There's erosion going on, a sort of formation of new deserts. It's horrible to think about that. And it also makes people, again, move to other places. And then, of course, we recently had this disaster of the COVID pandemic, which is only one example of the infectious diseases we were confronted with as human beings, but also in the sector of agriculture, animals, etc. So if I summarize that, then we see that this shows a picture that we are in the middle of a lot of technological developments, all bringing us new challenges, but also loads of opportunities, I think. Secondly, we see that because people move from places to other places, for all the reasons I mentioned, that will have as its effect an increasing diversity, which is something we are facing in education, and it gives us also new challenges and, again, opportunities. But it also, well, let's not talk too causal. It is, things are related, but not necessarily in a causal relation. So we see at the same time a sort of authority crisis, that people sort of question the authority of the governments, of whatever authority is involved in society and also in education. Like, who are you as my teacher to tell me this, while I think from my background that it is different? So to even sketch a broader picture, this leads to a sort of kind of knowledge relativism, We know all the expressions like alternative facts and all these thoughts about things not being true or being biased or being affected by complot theories, etc. So there is really a challenge to sort of get together again and see how science and how knowledge development works and share all the agreements we have on the procedures we follow to see to it that knowledge indeed is valid and applicable and worthwhile. Also, we see shifting views and roles in education. In a lecture I gave in a previous conference, I sketched that people tend to think about learning, for instance, by comparing learning to their smartest invention being the computer. But if you look how the computer developed, you see that we developed from perceptions of learning as, let's say, the absorption of knowledge that is elsewhere developed, to information processing, towards theories on connectivism and connectionism, where learning was all of a sudden a social thing in which people shared knowledge and enriched it together and made a next step, until where we are now, that we see that it seems that as if learning is something that of course takes place in your mind and is discussed and shared with others, but it also seems now that it is sort of growing beyond the individual minds. It is like if you open the computer again after a while, then you see that knowledge has grown, has made transitions, has showed developments that most of the ones who were part of the knowledge development even didn't realize. So that's where we are, and that makes it even more difficult to identify what to teach, what is relevant, what is our common base of action, and what is especially the common base of action society can benefit from. And then last but not least, we are facing in many countries in Europe and even worldwide a shortage of teachers. So there's so many challenges, there's so many changes going on, there's so many crises even, and issues we need to find solutions for, and yet there's a shortage of teachers, and we do not yet seem to have found the trigger to solve that. I sometimes think in this respect, I know it's a tricky remark, but that we see, well, yeah, I think we see such a feminization of education that if we have such a shortage of teachers, couldn't we then find a way to bring men back again into education? It would help almost 50%, I think. So, but I think we need to develop thoughts that would be helpful, and I think that in the end we probably all agree that for the future generations it is better to be educated by the previous generations and not by half of the previous generation. So given all this, I thought not moving is no option. So that's why educators are on the move, because solutions need to be found. And resilience must grow, so we are better prepared for future crises and challenges. And in that respect also leadership is needed, and also solidarity, because now we see too often that the crises and the issues sort of divide people rather than that they unite people. And I have a feeling that in some places already we see that people are beginning to realize that, and they are sort of increasingly looking for solutions in the middle again instead of in the extremes. But I think we still need to move there a little, maybe a lot. As I said, I have been involved in European projects throughout my professional life. I was a member of ATEE since 1986. Yes, I'm old. And one of the last projects I was involved in as a member, it is a project led by Mari Beaton from Leeds Beckett University. And it was a project in which we focused on how this crisis of the COVID pandemic, how that affected education. And we tried to support teachers and other educators and school leaders to cope with these circumstances, but also we tried to learn from what we saw happening for future situations. And we saw in this pandemic actually a pattern of 4 waves of response. The first was a technological wave. And I'm sure you all recognize that at first we thought, now we need to turn to distant education. It must be online education. So what will we choose? Will we choose? First of all, do we have the equipment to make it all possible? And secondly, do we have the programs to make it possible? And which devices are we going to use and how are we going to use it? Do we use Zoom or Teams or Mahara or whatever platforms? And do we have the people in schools or in colleges or in universities to support all that? So it was a big technological search for solutions to this problem of not being able to have face-to-face education anymore. And then when the platforms were chosen and the equipment was selected, etc., the next phase arose in which the question was, and now that we have these equipments and these platforms, how are we going to use it? How do we manage such platform? How can we work in groups and split into groups? How can we see to it that we engage students while we often had to switch off the screens because of the lack of capacity of the infrastructure? And how do you then connect to people you can't see if they're only a name on the screen? And how do you monitor and assess the progress made by students or learners? We're talking about teacher educators here, so, and I'd like that to be as inclusive as possible, meaning not only initial teacher educators, but also in-service educators or professional developers or however you'd like to refer to such people. One aspect is also the fact that it's not only about how do you monitor your students, but it's also how do you connect to them in such a way that you can really serve them, that you really can attune to their needs, and that you know their needs, and that you do not fall into the pitfall of thinking that it's enough to have a sort of mainstream or average view of what the needs are. The third wave was a social emotional wave when it all of a sudden became clear that the learners were not particularly happy about this online connectivity because of, well, especially in initial teacher education, there was a sense of loneliness, of being disconnected, of being not allowed to have the opportunities to develop and acculturize socially in your sector, get to know your future colleagues or get to know your peer students and engage in all the things people, let's for instance think about this initial stage of teacher education, the things people engage in that phase of their life were sort of made impossible because of this online work. Another thing that popped up in our project was the fact that it became obvious that working online required sort of what was referred to in literature as web etiquette, something like a code of conduct for how you connect respectfully to fellow learners or students online, and how you avoid that you are just in your own bubble. You may remember how it showed that some people, they were even in bed while attending classes, or some people had a sort of loss of decorum in the virtual world, while others were very capable of being present no matter the distance education. So I think there was a challenge as well. And there was the challenge of helping people to maintain a sense of purpose. Like, what am I working on? What does this education mean to me for my personal and professional development, and for my, as I said, introduction into a profession, or in maintaining the relations in my profession? And then I think it happened maybe, well, it was postponed quite long before teachers began to realize that this pandemic had been so exhausting for them. And I have here a quote of a researcher who actually quotes a teacher who said, "My brain feels like a browser with 100 tabs open." I felt that was a sort of, yeah, I could very well identify with that. And people were in a way sort of remote. They were disconnected in a way, although they were connected. But at the same time, they became demanding. Like, if you send in a test, then you want an immediate feedback. And that's what leads to expressions like this. Like, you have the feeling that because you cannot perform the way you'd like to perform, you have an extra obligation to do everything you can to overcome this obstacle and serve the students the way you wish, or serve your the target group the way you wish. So that led to this workload wave. And in this project, I was mentioning the RAPID project, we try to provide actually an electronic learning environment, a website, and with tools on it, meant to help teachers give support. Well, first of all, to support teachers, and secondly, to help teachers support each other. And also to help educators in schools and outside school to connect. So increasingly we had a feeling that also, if you think about those waves, that teachers realized that in order to overcome the challenges of the pandemic, it was necessary to connect to other professionals. First of all, of course, the ICT professionals. We couldn't cope with this pandemic if we hadn't been supported in further developing ICT skills, how to use them, how to improve the use of ICT tools, and etc. To develop digital literacy, and be competent, and also be a model for the learners, even though there's often actually a difference in experience. So this is already an example of a solution in which the way the educators move is together with the learners and together with the teachers. The teacher educators work on the solution of problems while involving also other stakeholders and other actors involved in this road towards a solution. And this is something I will come back later again. It's an example, in my view, of not some people thinking what is good for others, but it is about people thinking together how they can support each other on the road to solutions. And that's actually what I have in mind when I think on the move. So I will give you some implications for teachers and some for teacher educators. The first challenge, of course, and that is, I don't want to look back at the Corona times all the time. So it is, I hope I made it clear that the challenge is to be prepared for whatever might happen. And things will happen, and I'm not here to threaten you, but we all know it, that there are continuous challenges, and the crises I mentioned were examples of it. And the thing is, if you come to think about it when it happens, then you're often too late. And there is a sort of, let's say, meta level at which you can be prepared to things no matter what. And so I would like to point that out. Secondly, I think that in approaching people while facing challenges, it is also important to be prepared for this 3 or 4 wave phenomenon. So it means that you can already anticipate that this will happen. That first you may try to find technical solutions for problems you're facing. Then you think about, and how can we optimize the solutions? And then you think about, what does that emotionally to people? And fourthly, you think, and how does it affect me? And how do I keep the spirit and the health and also the mission alive? And of course, it is important that all the solutions you work on, you do not create them or develop them for the occasion when necessary, but you also store them so you can build further on them later on. So I spoke to Brad Olsen during the break, and I said, well, maybe you could consider it more like you're sort of pushing a snowball together, which grows while pushing. And you don't lose the snow, but you include it. I know, and I will come back to that later, that of course we shouldn't hold a plea for a future in which education contains more and more and more and more, because you also need to skip things and you need to be efficient. And but I find the importance of the metaphor that we're pushing the ball together and making it grow together. And then in professional development, we saw in this Rapide project, for instance, but also in other projects I was involved in, that the range of tasks teacher educators and teachers are involved has extended tremendously. For instance, in the COVID crisis, it appeared that the communication with parents became increasingly important, because parents also became part of the educative force. They had to teach at home as well. And also this ICT knowledge had to be involved in schools. Because it was difficult to work on the social dimension. It was, for instance, at one point in time also important to involve sports clubs or social work or let's say all sorts of societal organizations other than educators in this process, so that together problems could be solved. So in that complexity, it's important that you don't assume that everybody can do everything. That is what many teacher educators and teachers felt they were supposed to. So they were supposed to be, let's say, teachers, curriculum developers, courseware developers, communicators, let's say, brokers. They had to perform all these functions and roles, and it was too much. And schools that managed to sort of differentiate better said, well, those who are good at this, they do more of this, and those who are good at that, they are more involved in that. These schools appear to be more effective. So It means that you divide tasks according to competences and maybe also according to preferences. But then there's a risk, and that is that you sort of outsource the task to other colleagues and forget to gain competences for yourself. So that's why I say that after dividing and allocating tasks, please work together and learn together. The ICT is again a good example. If you think, I know nothing about ICT, I'm just a geographer, for instance, then you will be a bad geographer in the end, because you don't know anything about ICT. And also in geography, ICT becomes part of the profession. So you have to develop these neighboring disciplines to an extent that you have the ability to keep control over the common quality of what you offer. So you can't divide tasks endlessly. You must also work on the mutual understanding between the people who do the different tasks. And that implies that people also need to be involved in helping each other acquiring this knowledge. I sometimes have the feeling that, especially in the ICT world, but there are definitely other examples, that there's such a jargon, there is such a inclination to protect the expertise, that it almost seems as if people sort of defend the importance of their work by creating a bubble others do not understand. And I think that is the straight way to failure. We should share knowledge and make our common endeavors successful by invading into each other's disciplines to some extent. So we build knowledge together, and that's a point I really like to make, that people engage into to a kind of ongoing, responsive program development. I'm a bit reluctant here because I know that I first had the word curriculum development, but then I know that the word curriculum is so confusing in an international context because in different countries it has different meanings. Then I thought, well, then I may better use the word program. But basically, I mean that, let's say the traditional model is that experts do a needs analysis, and based on that they create a competence profile, and this competence profile then is enriched with content people need to process in order to acquire those competences, and then based on that a curriculum is made, and the curriculum then is implemented as a pilot, and then when the pilot is over it is implemented for real if it doesn't contain too much revisions already, so it needs to be piloted again. So often 6-7 years later, a new curriculum reaches the reality. And I think all these transitions sketched here make it impossible to be part of such a slow process. So that is why I hold a plea for this ongoing program development, and I will get into more details of that later on. Here you see that. So I think that the thought for me occurred first when I was involved as a consultant in a project of an ICT vocational college, well, higher vocational college. Actually, it was a university of practical or applied sciences. And they had, let's say in 1 year, they had 100 students of ICT, and the next year they had 900 such students. And so they had to employ teachers and teachers and teachers, and in the end they couldn't. And then they did an experiment on couldn't we create and deliver and revise and revitalize elements of the curriculum together. So students do not only study ICT, but they also produce let's say, educative material to spread on the message to the next year's students. And they actually do that. So they become developers and teachers at the same time. And in that way, this snowball effect appeared. And I think that by now, we are in that stage in teacher education as well. That if you think about how our life is affected by the huge trends we are facing now, let's take this energy thing or the sustainability problems we have. If we still make that part of these slow circular, well, no, not even circular, linear movements actually, then we will be too late with our solutions. But if we make that a sort of shared, common concern about among all parties concerned, including the students, the teachers, the other stakeholders, the other educators, other key players in society, but also authorities, then I think that we will definitely be on the move and get closer to solutions. Of course, then I put here as a sort of side remark, I do realize that not all the knowledge we transfer in education and in teacher education needs to be revised at such speed. And if we would decide to sort of speed up in everything, then we would lose our attempt, well, our fight against all the transitions already before starting it. So we must differentiate between speeds. We have knowledge that is sort of more slowly developing, and other kinds of knowledge that are in a more quick flow of development, because the challenges we try to solve with them are so urgent. So I think you can save time by keeping the basics at a low flame and the urgent business at a more, let's say, fastly speeded up mode. And again, I'd like to defend the idea that if we want to be successful, then we will need to invest time. We already have a shortage of teachers and teacher educators, and given that fact, there is no solution if we do not involve others. In some cities in the Netherlands, we already are facing the problem that schools have reduced the number of school days in the week to 4 days because they couldn't staff the 5th day. But they then try to solve that problem by involving, for instance, people from the arts sector, from the music sector, well, that's also part of the arts sector. Or people from, well, I heard an example of a person from a tourist agency who incidentally gave geography lessons. And the idea is, if you just mix that in a curriculum without being very explicit about it, about who are the real professionals and who are the ones bringing the examples, then it might be the end of education. But given the urgency of the shortage of teachers, this seems to be a solution that is at least transparent. You see, 1 day a week, people come to the school to bring knowledge of their crafts, of their arts, of their philosophies, of their social roles, etc. And that is additional content, which is maybe not the highest level of teaching, but it is a way to solve the shortage problems. And at the same time, people discover that it has additional value. Even more than what I saw in a lot of literature about this lateral access of teachers. Teachers gaining lateral access into the educational system, they often are facing the fact that they are seen as people from another culture than the educative culture, and therefore they experience entry problems. But if you are obviously entering the system without being part of the core of the system, then it's easier. Still, I'd like to also defend the idea of this lateral axis, because I also think that that is necessary and has an added value to the educational system. So teacher educators, given all that I said, in my view, should be willing to cross boundaries, and I don't mean only boundaries between countries, but boundaries between their profession and other disciplines, as I state here. And they also need to cross boundaries between the real and the digital world. They need to move between research and practice. I saw a very recent publication where it was also indicated that the identity of teachers has shifted from an identity mainly based on teaching towards a sort of mixture, but increasingly containing elements of research as part of the necessary content or concept of teaching, because teaching is on the move, and you can't be on the move if you don't have new inputs. So research provides that. Also, it is important that the boundaries between the phases of professional development, so let's say the initial teacher training, the induction into the profession, the mid-career support for teachers, and maybe also things like training for school leadership. And so it's important that such things are connected, because increasingly, and that's not a new message to you, of course, career development and lifelong learning are seen as interconnected. And if that is supposed to be interconnected, it also should be a coherent approach in which people experience their own development, their growth, and know where they are in view of what they see as their professional perspective. I have been in projects on, for instance, heritage education, I told. And I see that involving people from the heritage sector into education offers loads of opportunities of enriching the environment in which students or learners at whatever stage of their career can give meaning to their own knowledge and the progress they're making. I was in projects on entrepreneurship. There I saw the same. I saw also in the mix when learners were asked to develop a development plan for a particular castle somewhere, for instance. And it appeared that by trying to produce a business plan for a castle, they had to think about who lived there, in what eras, in what ages, what was life like. So they had to dive into the history of it. They had to think about what would visitors like to see here, what would they like to take with them as a message, but also as maybe a gadget or and then the end result was that these learners became more competent entrepreneurs. But what was more important, in my view, well, more important, but to me it was an extra added value, was the fact that they knew far more about such castle than those who had been informed about the castle. So this active involvement and making it a heritage and education effort, to combine that has an added value. So that's part of my plea again, that education is not something educators do only, or maybe you could also argue educators are not only teachers or in-service educators, but there are so many other educators involved. Well, if you look at the communications of the European Commission, you see that they think very much along the same lines, and they see challenges like indeed teacher training, like solving green and digital transitions, to promote inclusion, to raise the quality of education. And so that gives a sort of, well, I thought support for the ideas. The OECD made similar future plans, which they're interesting because they're sort of basically showing that we are making progress in our thoughts, but at the same time sort of revisiting history by thinking about how schools should be seen as separate entities or how they should integrate into society and make society a learning place rather than society a working place and schools only learning places. Actually, these four scenarios show different shades of gray in this field of education, moving from an institutional entity towards a process of all people and professionals involved. I think that then I thought I've talked so far so much about structures and how structures should be moving, how people should move over boundaries and how they should make others move with them. But I thought they need to move themselves as well. So if you look at the more individual perspective, then you need to think that teachers to do all this, and teacher educators to do all this, need to be having flexible work relations. And that requires a flexible mind, and a flexible mind moves better in a body that's healthy, and a healthy body functions better if it moves. And it's also important for teachers to move into the world of the learners, so teacher educators into the world of the teachers. Maybe also to move outside their comfort zone. I mean, sticking to how things used to be is the easy thing and doesn't require much movement. The challenge, of course, is to overcome the reluctance to get over these boundaries and embrace change and include physical activity. Well, the only physical activity I introduced, well, I allowed here was fans to move. But I think that if movement or physical exercise is introduced into learning, so it is actually moving towards each other, moving together, walking and talking together, when it's really active, then it becomes inspiring. And well, from a completely other field of study, you see that, for instance, for people in old age, that if they move around, then they keep much longer up to date. They get a flexible mind because they get different impressions. And I think that's not only true for elderly people. So I would say that's also a way to be on the move. And then a completely other difference, the meaning of the word move is that it's also important to move your audience in the emotional sense, that they wish to move with you because what you tell them is moving them. So that's the individual part, that I think in order to face the challenges of the future, we need to be flexible, but also move. This is a bit of static kind of flexibility, but we need to move. I think teacher educators on the move is both our reality and our mission. That is what I would like to give you as a message and as an introduction today. Thank you.